President Trump is re-elected, then he's one of the few people in the world who could come in and actually secure a good deal for Ukraine. And the reason I say this, a good deal in the current circumstances, to be clear. The reason I say this is the way to negotiate, I would imagine, you tell me more with your experience, but the way I imagine you might negotiate in the situation is you have to say two things to Putin at the same time. Number one is we recognize the fact that you have made forward progress in Ukraine. You have occupied territory, and we are willing to make concessions on that basis, right? Because that's the reality on the ground. There is no other way around it. On the other hand, if you do not accept these fairly limited concessions we are offering you now, if you don't accept these fairly limited concessions we're offering to you now, we will give Ukraine everything. Everything we've got. We're going to ramp up manufacturing. We're going to not just give them artillery shells. We're going to give, and not HIMARS, which is fairly dated technology, actually. We're going to give them the good kit. We're going to give them lots of it. If you do not take this deal now, this will be the best deal that you've ever been offered. That is a difficult line to tread, given where some of our reserves and public sentiment are. But that's, I think, what it takes. So I sadly think that as the West, we're not doing enough to help the Ukrainians win. And we should be honest with ourselves about that and with them, because otherwise all we're doing is causing more people to be killed on both sides. Now, you know, a very cynical person might say, well, that's what the West really wants, is to damage Russia, and they don't care about Ukraine. I care about Ukraine, and I don't think that's what we should be doing.
It's astonishing to me that Russia persists when we're now told they may have lost 500,000 young men. Unbelievable. That just shows you how distorted and how bad people can actually be to let that continue.
It's a cultural thing as well, John. I think we talked about it last time. But if you look at the casualties in World War II, for example, the Soviet Union lost 20 million people. And look at the wars with Finland, for example, in which the Soviet Union invaded, lost hundreds of thousands of men for very little territorial gain or any practical gain, really. This is in Russian culture, in Russian kind of mythology, the idea of sacrificing lots of soldiers for the greatness of Russia, for the nation, is pretty normal. And by the way, used to be pretty normal in most countries, actually. If you think about Napoleon, for example. Napoleon, you know, had no problem sacrificing hundreds of thousands of French men for the glory of, well, himself mainly, but you know what I mean. So Russia still has that mindset. And I think we delude ourselves in the West if we imagine that there is a level of casualties on that scale, at least, that would be a strong deterrent to Russia. That wouldn't be. What would be a strong deterrent would be if they were losing. And if someone came in and said to them, look, you can keep losing, or you can do this deal now. And I've said from day one, as you know, I was on Question Time a week after Putin invaded Ukraine, and I made this point then, and I've been making it ever since. The likely outcome here was always going to be that the Ukrainians would have to put up a fight, give Russia a bloody nose, and then come to the negotiating table, give away some things that, frankly, I use the term don't care about. Now, of course, people in Ukraine care about Crimea and the eastern regions to the extent that it is technically part of their country, but it hasn't been for some years now. It's unlikely to be recovered without significant ramping up of Western support. And so the question is, what was all this for? Because when you say Russia may have lost up to 500,000 men, you have to recognize that Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of men too, yes. Almost certainly, and had its cities bombed and its infrastructure destroyed and what was all this for? And my view always was that if we were going to support Ukraine to fight and encourage them to fight, then it had to be for one very important objective, the only important objective in this entire conflict, which is to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty for the next 100 years. For the next 100 years. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's either membership of NATO, it's some sort of Korean-style scenario, or it's UN peacekeepers or something where it's no longer a piece of paper. You are now part of some sort of bloc, which means you're physically safe from ever being invaded by Russia again. That's the only thing that was ever worth fighting for in Ukraine. And that's the deal that now needs to be struck. How you achieve that, that's going to be a challenge, but I certainly don't see it being achieved by the current US administration.